Let me take a few moments and discuss about analyzing unusual network protocols as part of IoT pen testing. So this is actually part of the book Practical IoT Hacking. I believe that's what it's called. Let me actually look into the table of contents. Not the table of contents, but yeah, so Practical IoT Hacking. And I've made another video about what this book contains. And right now I got to a very interesting point in the book, and that is what do you do, or what is your approach when you're actually penetration testing on a device, on an IoT device that actually runs on an unusual network protocol. So as you can see, when you're working with unusual protocols, it's best to analyze them according to a methodology. So the methodology, and in this specific video, we're actually going to cover only the information gathering part. So the methodology involves information gathering, analysis, prototyping, and security auditing. So when it comes to information gathering, as you'll see, you might want to start with actually documentation. So documenting the official guides for the protocol, if there are any. So this is actually the first step number one, as you can see over here. Then what you want to do is to actually enumerate and install the client. So if or once you have access to the documentation, you will want to be looking over all the clients that are available for that type of protocol. And as you can see, you can use these to replicate and generate traffic at will. So different clients might implement the protocol with small variations, and you might want to look into those variations. And the more clients and implementation you find, the higher your chances are finding better documentation. So I would actually be focusing on looking into the differences, because differences of implementation might reveal important aspects of how the protocol actually runs. I know this is a bit abstract, but if I'm actually going to run a sequel of this video, we're actually going to look into DI-COM protocol for medical devices. So we're actually going to get more specific, but right now, when you're doing penetration testing on a network protocol, this might not be necessarily very specific to IoT devices, but in general, when you're doing a penetration testing on a network protocol that is unusual, you might want to start by, so in the phase of information gathering, phase number one of information gathering, you might want to start looking for documentation. And if there is a documentation available, you might want to see if there are clients to actually run that protocol or that application on. Now, the second thing that you want to do is discover dependent protocols. As you can see, the example given is for the SMB, which generally works with NetBIOS SSN. So NetBIOS with the NBT over TCP/IP. So in this case, you will find it is very likely that you will find this type of information in the documentation. So you want to go back to step one by really analyzing that the documentation. And I keep saying this, documentation is a wealth of information. So whatever you're doing, whatever kind of cybersecurity assessment you're doing, documentation is golden, because that's what most people do not read. A lot of cybersecurity professionals, as harsh as it may sound, just follow a very simplistic protocol by using some sort of a tool approach and run automated tools without actually understanding. And we might suffer the curse of tools. And so the curse of tools and tooling, because we rely on tools, a lot of them, and methodologies are good, but if you just stick to methodologies, you're going to stick to conventional thinking. And I'm really talking about OWASP here. So I'm talking about OWASP, and I've actually asked the question on social media the other day, what is someone's vulnerability? What are the favorite vulnerabilities of people, of cybersecurity people, other than those listed in the OWASP top 10? And I have about 8,000 people who are actually following me on Twitter, and I've got a few results, I've got a few replies, and some of them said injection. I didn't even bother to reply to that because injection is already on the OWASP list. So you have to start thinking outside the box and looking into the documentation. So looking into the documentation for whatever type of thing that you're testing on, documentation is golden, and it's going to reveal a lot of gems and a lot of the aspects of the underlying infrastructure that you're testing. So you want to be looking into that. Now, the next thing, figure out a protocol's port. This is step number 3 in the information gathering of unusual network protocols. Figure out the protocol's port. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that are worth mentioning here. First off is that a lot of tools and a lot of protocols are actually running on default ports. But that's just a convention. Like, for example, SSH runs by default on 22, just because probably the person who invented or who first set up the rules or the applications for SSH, so SSH is 22, just thought, hey, let's pick a random port and let's do 22. Now, we know that there are applications that and that you can install applications on whatever port that you want. Because when you're configuring an SSH server, you actually, with a lot of the software that's available, you actually have the ability to choose whatever port you have. 22 is by default, but you can choose like 239 if you want, or 2222. So it's up to whatever your desire is. Now, when you figure out a protocol's port, this is another information that you have most specifically available in the documentation. As you can see here, for example, Nmap reconnaissance script might not run if we write an inaccurate execution rule. So tools like Nmap and Wireshark usually work with the default ports. So, for example, Wireshark might not use the correct dissector. Although there are workarounds for these issues, it's best to have robust execution rules. Now, we might get into more specifics in future videos. Now, finding additional documentation. So it all ties up to the documentation when it comes to information gathering for pen testing unusual network protocols. Now, finding additional informations. In this specific case, they talk about Wireshark. And it's also, notice which areas lack documentation. Can you identify functions that aren't well described? A lack of documentation can point you toward interesting findings. So make sure you have a good understanding of this aspect. Now, finally, the last thing that I want to talk about, and that's said here, is testing Wireshark dissectors or dissectors. So test whether all the Wireshark dissectors work properly against the protocol in use. Can Wireshark interpret and read all fields correctly in the protocol messages? So to actually do this, the very first thing is to look into Wireshark. So in this case, you are testing a specific unusual network protocol using Wireshark. And the first thing that you have to do is check whether Wireshark has a dissector for this specific protocol and whether or not that dissector is enabled. And to do that, you go into Analyze Enabled Protocols, as seen here in the figure, and look whether or not the dissector is enabled for your specific protocol. So if the protocol specifications are public, check that all fields are identified correctly, especially with complex protocols. Dissectors often have errors. Now, to get more ideas, review the list of CVEs assigned to Wireshark dissectors. So you might want to be looking into that. Okay, now in future videos, if there is interest, I might go into more in-depth in this specific interesting aspect of IoT penetration testing.